Welcome to PandaAudioBooks, the perfect place for a huge collection of fantasy novels. If you enjoy my content and want to support my work, a small contribution via PayPal is greatly appreciated. And don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the notifications bell to stay updated with our latest audiobook chapters. Chapter 1571, Battling a Body Integration Cultivator. However, Han Li had no intention of battling an early body integration cultivator under these circumstances. He flapped his wings without any hesitation, and spiritual light flashed from his body as he shot forth through the air as an azure thread, accelerating to close to twice his original speed, thereby allowing him to match the speed of the streak of red light. In just the span of a few breaths, the two of them had disappeared into the distance. The humanoid figure within the streak of red light was naturally none other than the elderly man from the Jiao Kai race. Using the profound heaven-shifting disc, he was able to track down Han Li's location, but before he could get close to Han Li, the latter suddenly accelerated and fled at an alarming speed. The elderly man's heart jolted with shock upon seeing this, but his astonishment was then quickly replaced by elation. It appeared that the being that he was pursuing was quite powerful, so it was quite likely that he was carrying one of the items he was seeking. Thus, the elderly man was even more determined to hunt Han Li down. The two of them hurtled through the air like a pair of shooting stars, making no efforts to conceal themselves, and it only took them a short while to cover a distance of hundreds of kilometers. During this time, the streak of red light was still unable to chase down the azure thread, and the elderly man was truly becoming rather surprised. Even though he wasn't proficient in movement techniques, his spiritual sense had clearly just revealed to him that his target was only a 7th-tier upper race being. As such, it was quite incredible that he'd managed to avoid being chased down over such a vast distance. However, the elderly man was a fearsome body integration stage being, after all, so he naturally possessed a vast wealth of battle experience. As such, he abruptly stopped cold in his tracks before flipping a hand over expressionlessly to summon a purple talisman. He waved the talisman gently through the air, and a cloud of purple mist erupted, instantly permeating through an area with a radius of over 100 feet and completely concealing his body within. Han Li had been keeping an eye on his pursuer this entire time, and his brows furrowed slightly upon seeing this. He also immediately stopped mid-flight before casting his gaze behind him with narrowed eyes. He was rather curious about just what his opponent was plotting. The purple cloud of mist tumbled and surged before suddenly vanishing, and the elderly man within it also disappeared without a trace. Han Li's expression changed slightly, and he instantly released his spiritual sense to encompass an area with a radius of several tens of feet. However, the elderly man was still nowhere to be found, as if he'd truly completely disappeared. A grim expression appeared on Han Li's face, and he made a hand seal as blue light flashed through his eyes, activating his bright sight spirit eyes ability. However, even with his spirit eye ability, he was still unable to track down the elderly man. Han Li's heart truly sank this time. Body integration stage beings were extremely fearsome opponents, so losing sight of one in battle could prove to be lethal. With that in mind, Han Li immediately fled into the distance as an azure thread. He didn't know where his opponent was lurking, but staying in this place for too long would naturally be extremely dangerous for him. However, if his opponent gave chase, then Han Li was confident that he'd be forced to reveal himself. Thus, the azure thread hurtled through the air, covering a distance of over 1,000 feet in just a single flash and rapidly disappeared into the distance. As Han Li flew through the air, he continued to cast his gaze behind him while maintaining his spirit eye ability. Moments later, he finally discovered something, and he raised an eyebrow in response to this discovery. Extremely deep within the ground several kilometers behind him, there was a purple humanoid figure traveling through the soil without any impediment. It was none other than the elderly man from the Jiao Kai race. He had unleashed some kind of ability that had allowed him to instantly burrow several hundred feet deep into the ground, and Han Li failed to notice him initially due to a split second of complacency. However, for the elderly man to remain so blurry and indistinct even in the face of Han Li's bright sight spirit eyes indicated that he was using quite an extraordinary concealment technique. Furthermore, not only had the elderly man managed to conceal himself underground, he was traveling even quicker through the soil than he was when flying in the air. Not only did the soil not impede him in the slightest, there were specks of yellow light constantly flying out from within the soil before injecting themselves into his body to further enhance his speed. Even though Han Li was already flying as quickly as he could, the elderly man was still slowly gaining on him. Han Li was rather surprised by this discovery, but he showed no sign of stopping or slowing down. Meanwhile, the elderly man that was surging through the soil was growing rather frustrated. He had thought that his disappearance would strike panic into Han Li's heart, and even if he decided to flee the scene, he would gradually decelerate or even temporarily stop. However, Han Li had fled without any hesitation, and even after flying for so long, he still didn't slow down even in the slightest. That was quite surprising to the elderly man. He was very confident in his concealment abilities. So in his mind, there was no way that a being with a cultivation base far inferior to his would be able to see through him with their spiritual sense. The only exception would be if said being possessed some kind of spirit eye ability, but the probability of that was so low that it was virtually negligible. Seeing as Han Li hadn't fallen for his ploy, the elderly man could only continue to give chase using his earth movement technique. However, he could naturally also see that he was traveling slightly faster than Han Li using this movement technique, so he naturally wasn't going to give up in his chase. Thus, the two of them traveled for thousands of kilometers without pause. Han Li could see the purple humanoid figure drawing closer and closer to him underground, and his expression gradually darkened as he began to inspect his surroundings. All of a sudden, a pair of tall mountains positioned alongside one another appeared up ahead. Both of the mountains were quite lush and steep, and there was a dense forest in between the two of them. Han Li's heart stirred upon seeing this before he cast a glance downward with blue light flashing through his eyes. At this point, the purple figure was only just over 1,000 feet away from him and was on the cusp of chasing him down. Thus, Han Li took a deep breath before suddenly changing directions and flying toward that forest. The azure thread flashed through the air before plunging into the forest, following which Han Li reappeared. Immediately thereafter, he rustled a sleeve, and several tens of small swords shot forth from within. He made a hand seal, and all of the small swords plunged into the ground as azure threads. Countless azure threads then flashed through the air, and the surrounding trees were all felled in an instant. Thus, an area with a radius of several thousand feet had opened up in the blink of an eye. After doing all that, Han Li swayed before appearing atop a tree stump that was several tens of feet tall, then pointed a finger up ahead in an expressionless manner. Immediately thereafter, the azure light faded, and all of the azure threads concealed themselves into empty space. Han Li then made a hand seal, and a loud thunderclap rang out as countless thin arcs of golden lightning erupted from his body, forming a golden and silver lightning robe. Following a surge of black chi, a suit of black baleful armor also appeared beneath his robes. After doing all that, Han Li opened his mouth to produce a small translucent shield, which began to rapidly rotate around him. Having made all of his preparations, Han Li simply clasped his hands behind his back and looked up into the sky in a completely stationary manner. In the soil deep beneath Han Li, the elderly man was appraising Han Li's every move with a vicious look in his eyes. He had finally chased down Han Li, but instead of pouncing right away, he wasn't in a hurry to strike. However, the elderly man didn't have much patience for an opponent with such a significantly inferior cultivation base, either. He swept his spiritual sense through the surrounding area to confirm that there were no other beings or traps nearby, following which a sinister look appeared on his face, and he abruptly disappeared from within the soil. In the next instant, an earth-shattering boom erupted, and the tree stump that Han Li was standing on exploded as a pair of massive crimson hands shot forth from the soil down below in an attempt to grab at his legs. However, Han Li seemed to have already anticipated this attack, and his body blurred without any premonition before he abruptly appeared over 100 feet away in a flash. A cold harumph rang out, and Han Li had only just reappeared when red light flashed before him, and the elderly man also revealed himself. A ferocious light flashed through his eyes as he raised both arms up into the air in unison. Two crimson fist projections instantly appeared before hurtling toward Han Li, sending a scorching heat wave surging toward him. This high-grade Jiao Kai being was also a simultaneous cultivator. A hint of surprise flashed through Han Li's eyes as he reached out with an inky black hand, pressing downward from above. A small black shadow flew forth from his palm in a flash, then transformed into a small mountain that was several tens of feet tall before descending in a soundless manner, heading directly toward the red fist projections. The elderly man's lips twitched upon seeing this, and instead of changing his attack, a derisive sneer appeared on his face. He was fully aware of just how powerful those fist projections were, and that was something that Han Li would only come to realize in the instant before his death. With that in mind, the elderly man activated his cultivation arts to an even greater extent, and the pair of fist projections instantly swelled to around twice their original size, making them comparable in size to human heads. Furthermore, the crimson light emanating from the surface of the fist projections also became extremely bright, illuminating the nearby air in a piercing red hue, and the scorching temperatures radiating from them was making the surrounding air completely twist and warp. He was planning to use this pair of fist projections to shatter the divine essence-fused mountain. A peculiar look appeared on Han Li's face upon seeing this. Right at this moment, the fist projection and the underside of the small black mountain clashed in a completely soundless manner. The projections and the mountain tremored in unison before becoming completely motionless, as if they'd been captured in a stationary snapshot in time. However, a halo of grey and red light then appeared between the two before proliferating outward in all directions at an alarming rate. Han Li felt his eardrums tremor as a doomsday-like burst of rumbling rang out. The tree stumps down below were all instantly reduced to sawdust upon making contact with this halo of light, and the earth tremored violently as a huge crater with a radius of several hundred feet and a depth of around 10 feet was blasted into the ground. Han Li's heart jolted with shock as he hurriedly cast his gaze downward with blue light flashing through his eyes. There, the divine essence-fused mountain remained completely motionless, but the pair of fist projections beneath it had been eradicated. A pair of mundane-looking human hands were currently resisting the small mountain with all their might, preventing it from crashing directly downward. The owner of that pair of hands was none other than the elderly man. At this moment, his arms were slightly bent, and his face was flushed in an unhealthy manner, but he truly had managed to keep the divine essence-fused mountain at bay with just his hands and his immense strength. Chapter 1572. Fire Beats Wood. Han Li was rather surprised to see this, but his body immediately swayed, following which he abruptly appeared on the summit of the small mountain before tapping it with the tips of his toes. Grey light immediately began to surge around the small black mountain, and it swelled drastically to 3,000 feet in size. The elderly man had been able to just barely hoist up the small mountain in its former state, and his expression changed drastically in the face of this sudden development. His feet began to sink into the ground, and soon, he had been buried up to his calves. This was an indication that the elderly man's strength alone wasn't enough to keep the mountain at bay, thereby forcing him to transfer some of the force into the ground beneath his feet. Han Li looked on expressionlessly as he stomped down onto the small mountain again. The divine essence-fused mountain was extraordinarily heavy to begin with, and with Han Li's assistance, the black mountain was able to crash down once again, completely crushing the elderly man beneath it amid a rumbling boom. However, Han Li only became warier upon seeing this. He was certainly not going to be deluded into thinking that a body integration stage being would be so easy to kill. Thus, he made a hand seal with one hand while his other pristine white palm pressed down toward the black mountain. Grey light flashed over the surface of the mountain, and it continued to expand at a dramatic rate. At the same time, a burst of 5 colored flames also surged forth from his fingers before spreading over the ground at the foot of the mountain. A layer of 5-colored ice was instantly formed, transforming the ground down below in a radius of several hundred feet into a frosty glacial land. At this point, the Black Mountain had already swelled to over 10,000 feet tall, making it comparable to a real mountain. Even so, Han Li still showed no signs of stopping. Spiritual light flashed from his body, and he shot forth toward one side as a streak of azure light before abruptly disappearing into thin air. Immediately thereafter, a burst of low buzzing suddenly rang out in the air around the Black Mountain. A series of small azure swords emerged before transforming into palm-sized azure lotus flowers amid a flash of azure light. These lotus flowers rotated on the spot, and countless lotus flower projections surfaced around them before gradually taking on a more substantial form. All of a sudden, lotus flowers had concealed the entire sky, and they formed a massive barrier of light to completely ensnare the elderly man within. Han Li had taken advantage of this brilliant opportunity to activate his Spring Dawn sword formation. Right at this moment, a roar of fury erupted from beneath the mountain, following which a string of incantation chants rang out. Wisps of crimson light suddenly surfaced in the surrounding air. In the beginning, there were only around a dozen or so of these wisps of light, but as the incantations were recited more quickly, more and more wisps of red light began to appear. Moments later, virtually the entire sky had been stained red by the crimson light. At the same time, the temperatures in the surrounding area became extraordinarily high, hot enough to instantly reduce a mortal into human jerky. At this moment, the incantations ceased, and the wisps of crimson light all surged into the layer of 5-colored ice on the ground in a flash. Immediately thereafter, rumbling booms akin to loud thunderclaps rang out from underground. Moments later, pillars of crimson light that were each as thick as a large bowl broke through the layer of ice. The pillars of light only flashed a few times, and the layer of ice rapidly melted into nothingness. The nearby ground was also instantly dissolved into a crimson liquid by the red light. In just the span of a few breaths, a vast stretch of ground had been transformed into a massive lava pit. The black mountain slowly descended into the bubbling lava, and it didn't take long for most of the mountain to be completely submerged. As expected, it looks like this won't be enough to kill you. Han Li's indifferent voice abruptly rang out from all directions. Immediately thereafter, the black mountain shrank dramatically within the lava pit, reducing itself down to around a foot in size before surging back as a streak of white light. However, after it had traveled several tens of feet away from the lava, the elderly man's cold voice suddenly rang out. "I just so happen to be missing an ornamental treasure in my cave abode. This one's not bad." As soon as his voice trailed off, a massive wave of lava over 100 feet tall erupted from the lava pit down below. Immediately thereafter, red light flashed, and the lava transformed into a massive crimson hand that caught the small black mountain in its grasp. Red light flashed from the huge hand as it attempted to drag the mountain back into the lava. However, even though Han Li had already withdrawn most of the divine essence-fused mountain's power, its extraordinary weight was not something that could be easily moved by the massive hand. Thus, the black mountain managed to hold its position in mid-air, even as the giant lava hand continued to exert pulling force toward it. However, at the same time, it was unable to fly toward the nearby azure light barrier as Han Li had intended. At this moment, Han Li let loose a cold harumph, and spatial fluctuations erupted around the massive crimson hand, immediately following which countless azure threads appeared out of thin air. The azure threads flashed around the massive hand like lightning, instantly slicing its fingers into countless segments. Thus, the miniature black mountain was freed, and it flew away as a streak of azure light again before disappearing into the azure light barrier after just a few flashes. The azure threads also abruptly disappeared as if they had never even appeared in the first place. "You certainly do have some tricks up your sleeve. No wonder you have the courage to face me in direct battle." The elderly man didn't seem to have been irked by this development, but his voice was quite heavy and grim. Almost at the exact same moment, the lava down below parted, and the elderly man slowly emerged from within. His body was flashing with red light, and he only stopped after rising up over 100 feet into the air. He wore a cautious look on his face as he swept his gaze around him. "This is a sword formation." The elderly man's expression changed as he instantly identified the situation that he was in. However, in the instant that the elderly man revealed himself, the azure lotus flowers around him began to shimmer with brilliant light, following which countless lotus petals shot forth. As these flower petals flew through the air, they instantly transformed into azure blades of wind that surged toward the elderly man from all directions. The elderly man's expression darkened, and the red light emanating from his body abruptly swelled to form a crimson light barrier that shielded himself within. A string of spluttering sounds rang out as the blades of wind disappeared into the red light like moths diving into a flame. However, in the next instant, they were all reduced to balls of fire that incinerated them into nothingness. This high-grade Jiao Kai being's fire attribute cultivation arts were clearly extremely powerful to be able to ignite and incinerate even attacks manifested from wind. However, seeing as the elderly man had already been trapped in his sword formation, that was certainly not going to be the extent of the attacks that Han Li had prepared for him. In the instant that the blades of wind were proven to be ineffective, brilliant azure light flashed high up in the air above, following which a series of massive azure logs that were as thick as a water tank came crashing down from above. Upon closer inspection, one would discover that the logs were extremely dense and seemingly immensely heavy. However, the elderly man merely gave a cold chuckle as he swept a sleeve upward, sending the red light around his body hurtling toward the oncoming logs. After coming into contact with the red light, the massive azure logs were all quickly reduced to plumes of smoke and ashes. Save your energy, brat. If your sword formation were of some other attribute, perhaps you'd be able to cause some trouble for me, but pure wood attribute sword formations are completely ineffective against me. I can destroy this formation with ease. The elderly man suddenly let loose a loud cry as he abruptly made a hand seal. The red light around his body swayed, and pillars of crimson light suddenly shot forth in all directions, striking the azure light barrier in a flash. A scorching aura immediately permeated throughout the entire space that was enshrouded under the barrier of light. A triumphant look appeared on the elderly man's face. In his mind, his powerful fire attribute cultivation arts would be able to destroy this wood attribute sword formation with ease. After that, he could press his cultivation base advantage to kill this unexpectedly troublesome opponent. A string of dull thumps rang out, and just as the elderly man had expected, massive holes were punctured into the light barrier with ease. Just as the azure lotus flowers around him were about to dissipate, his surroundings suddenly blurred, and the azure lotus flowers abruptly disappeared along with the light barrier. In the next instant, he found himself in a completely unfamiliar place with massive trees that were several hundred feet tall all around him. An illusionary technique. Despite the elderly man's vast reserves of battle experience, he was truly astonished on this occasion. Illusionary techniques weren't all that uncommon in other formations and restrictions, but they were very rare in sword formations, which predominantly pursued maximal destructive power. At the very least, this was the first time that the elderly man had seen a sword formation with an accompanying illusionary technique. However, the elderly man quickly recomposed himself before making a hand seal, upon which red light flashed from his body, and a pillar of crimson flames rose directly up into the air. He then opened his mouth to expel a white talisman, and the talisman disappeared in a flash before forming a gust of white gale force winds that disappeared into the pillar of flames. Having been fanned by the fierce winds, the pillar of fire that was only around 10 feet in thickness originally rapidly swelled to over 100 feet thick, creating a very formidable sight to behold. The elderly man was situated at the very center of the pillar of flames, and he suddenly sat down with his legs crossed. At the same time, red light flashed above his head, and a massive projection of a sinister-looking beast that was entirely covered in crimson scales appeared. In the instant that the projection appeared, all of the world's origin chi in the nearby area was drawn to the elderly man at once. Pea-sized balls of 5-colored light began to surface from the mountains, forests, and plants within a radius of several tens of kilometers. All of them surged toward the sword formation in a frenzy, as if they had been summoned there by something. Countless specks of light came raining down from above, only be to instantly kept out by the streaks of azure sword chi that erupted from the sword formation. These specks of light exploded as they clashed with the sword chi to form clouds of 5-colored mist, but there were simply far too many specks of light to contend with. Within moments, the mist that resulted from the explosion of these specks of light had become as viscous as liquid, thereby significantly slowing down the streaks of sword chi and making them a lot more sluggish. Almost at the exact same moment, the elderly man unleashed a massive pillar of fire that also began to wreak havoc within the sword formation. The countless massive logs raining down from above were reduced to smoke and ashes without being able to offer up any resistance. These logs were only projections, but they had manifested from the pure wood attribute spiritual power within the flying swords. Regardless of whether these logs were real or not, there was no way that they'd be able to withstand such fierce fire attribute attacks. All of a sudden, the surroundings blurred around the elderly man, and he reappeared in the real world. Chapter 1573, Chaotic Heavenly Pouch and the Gourd. Han Li was hidden within the sword formation, and his heart sank slightly upon seeing this. As expected of a body integration stage being, even when trapped within a sword formation, he was still able to draw upon so much of the world's origin chi to exert pressure on the sword formation. However, this was also due to the large disparity between their cultivation bases. Otherwise, if Han Li were also at the body integration stage, he would have been able to easily scatter the world's origin chi gathered toward the sword formation. After all, it was far easier to scattering the world's origin chi than to summon it. This was also why beings above the spatial tempering stage very rarely drew upon the world's origin chi to directly attack their opponents. Even if they were to attempt that, it would be quite an arduous process, and if the opponent were of a similar cultivation base, they could easily wrest control over some of the world's origin chi that had been summoned. Thus, the only scenarios during which the world's origin chi would be summoned during battle would be if someone wanted to unleash some kind of powerful ability, or they'd run out of magic power, thereby forcing them to explore alternative power sources. Under such circumstances, it would be best to have a helper who could unleash an ability or had mastered a certain cultivation art that could allow them to summon the world's origin chi. That would make the world's origin chi more difficult for others to plunder. However, this was, overall, an extremely inefficient and risky course of action to be taken during battle, and the elderly man was only able to do so with such reckless abandon due to the fact that Han Li's cultivation base was far inferior to his. Thus, Han Li was naturally quite frustrated by this development. However, Qing Yuanzi had been able to combat body integration stage beings at just the spatial tempering stage, so he'd naturally prepared a countermeasure against attacks from the world's origin chi. Han Li exhaled as he rapidly flicked his 10 fingers through the air, sending one incantation seal after surging into the sword formation in a frenzy. Due to the compression from the world's origin chi from the outside and the pillar flames from the inside, the azure light barrier was flashing erratically, and the streaks of sword chi that were embroiled within the dense 5-colored mist also disappeared in unison. Immediately thereafter, the barrier of light swelled and shrank, following which the azure lotus flowers within suddenly spread their petals before rotating on the spot in a frenzy. One shimmering azure vortex after another surfaced on the light barrier in the blink of an eye. The viscous mist of the world's origin chi was sucked into these vortexes at a rapid rate, and around 1/10 of it was absorbed by the sword formation in the blink of an eye. Thus, the wavering sword formation instantly became very stable again. The elderly man within the sword formation was manipulating the pillar of flames to wreak havoc within the formation, and he naturally immediately sensed what was happening to the world's origin chi outside. His heart jolted with shock, having clearly not expected this sword formation to possess such a profound ability. If things were to continue like this, the world's origin chi that he'd gathered would only be working to fortify the sword formation. In a fit of shock and rage, the elderly man immediately let loose a loud cry, and the sword formation began to tremor as all of the world's origin chi gathered outside was dispersed by gusts of fierce winds amid a string of rumbling booms. Even so, with the world's origin chi that the sword formation had already absorbed, it had become far more robust and stable than before. Thus, the world's origin chi that he'd summoned had presented itself to his opponent on a silver platter. If word of this were to spread, he's become the laughing stock of all of his brethren. At the height of his fury, the elderly chuckled coldly as he laid a hand onto the top of his own head. Immediately thereafter, a streak of light shot forth from his head before forming a massive projection with a set of blurry facial features. Before Han Li had a chance to glean the true appearance of the projection, it surged toward the elderly man before disappearing into his body. The elderly man instantly threw his head back and let loose a long cry while his face took on a sinister and menacing appearance. His body also swelled to 60 to 70 feet tall, and the small red horn on his glabella had elongated to around half a foot in length, which crimson scales surfaced all over his body. In the blink of an eye, the elderly man had become a fearsome, devilish creature. A sinister smile appeared on his face as he flipped both of his hands over at once. In one hand, a faint golden flag appeared, over which a cloud of fiery mist was swirling incessantly. Meanwhile, a strange blue pouch appeared in his other hand. Both of them were tossed into the air without any hesitation, following which the elderly man began to chant something in a language that was completely foreign to Han Li. The flag waved itself through the air, and bursts of faint golden flames erupted from it. At the same time, the pouch bulged before expelling a burst of blue winds. Simultaneously, the elderly man opened his mouth to blast forth a fiery cloud that was as crimson as blood. The three then combined with the pillar of flames that was wreaking havoc within the sword formation. Red, blue, and golden light intertwined in an instant before forming a 3-colored pillar of light. An earth-shattering boom erupted within the sword formation, and Han Li knew that he couldn't stand by idly any longer. As such, he activated one powerful illusionary technique after another within the Spring Dawn sword formation. By everything that was manifested as part of those illusions were instantly destroyed by the 3-colored pillar of light. The Spring Dawn sword formation was completely unable to withstand such an assault, and the azure light barrier immediately began to flash erratically once again. Han Li drew a sharp breath upon seeing this. Half of his astonishment naturally arose from the immense power of the three-colored pillar of light, but the other half could be attributed to the blue pouch that the elderly man had produced following his transformation. That treasure was extremely familiar to him. It seemed to be a spirit treasure known as the Chaotic Heavenly Pouch, and it was listed on the Chaotic Myriad Spirit Roll. This spirit treasure was only a mid-range treasure among those on the Chaotic Myriad Spirit Roll, but it possessed a few incredible abilities that other treasures didn't possess, thereby earning it quite a reputation. Many years ago, the treasure had once belonged to a powerful being from the human race. However, that human later perished under unforeseen circumstances, and the spirit treasure disappeared as a result. In order to recover the treasure, many high-grade cultivators had searched through the human and demon territories, all to no avail. So how had it ended up in the hands of a Jiao Kai being on the Thunder Continent? This treasure was most definitely bad news for Han Li, and his mind raced for a way to counteract it. All of a sudden, a slightly bewildered look appeared on his face. According to the legends, the Chaotic Heavenly Pouch definitely possessed far more powerful abilities than what was being displayed within the sword formation. Could it be that this was only a replica? Or perhaps he'd wrongly identified it when it was actually some other kind of similar treasure? Han Li was unable to verify which notion was correct, but this was not something that he could carefully ponder under his present circumstances. The sword formation was about to fall, and Han Li's eyes narrowed as a cold light flashed through them. The legends about Qing Yuanzi using this sword formation to combat body integration stage beings were most likely true, but this likely due to the fact that Qing Yuanzi had also mastered the final few layers of the Azure Essence sword art, thereby allowing him to unleash the full power of the sword formation. He also had a set of refined Azure Bamboo Cloudswarm sword, but the cultivation arts he was using weren't prepared for this sword formation, so he was unable to unleash the trump card abilities that the sword formation possessed. This was why the sword formation appeared to be so inept in the face of the elderly man's attacks. However, after absorbing so much of the world's origin chi, there seemed to be a type of powerful ability that Han Li could just barely unleash with the sword formation. Han Li's eyes flashed as a thought occurred to him. This ability was indeed very powerful, but regardless of whether it proved to be effective or not, the sword formation itself would most likely instantly crumble following the event. However, Han Li had no choice but to give it a try under such circumstances. If the ability did indeed prove to be ineffective, then he'd have to use his 12 awakening transformations to engage his opponent in battle. In a worst-case scenario, he still had several types of talismans and his gold-devouring beetles as trump cards. Thus, Han Li remained quite calm throughout this battle against this early body integration stage being. In the next instant, Han Li began to chant something, and an incredible scene ensued within the sword formation. The azure light barrier in the air above suddenly blurred, following which a vine-like plant emerged before plunging into the light barrier. When it first appeared, it was only several inches in size, but it grew at a rapid rate that was discernible to the naked eye, swelling to several tens of feet in length in mere moments. The vine then immediately began to flower and bear fruit, forming a small green gourd right before the elderly man's astonished eyes. The gourd was only around the size of a human hand, and appeared to be completely mundane. However, in the next instant, the azure lotus flowers within the light barrier tremored in unison, and countless inch-long sword projections shot forth before disappearing into the gourd. Immediately thereafter, an azure sword insignia appeared on the surface of the gourd. The insignia was barely visible initially, but as vast amounts of five-colored light injected itself into the gourd along the vine, the insignia suddenly became extremely clear and began flashing with five-colored light. The elderly man didn't know what kind of ability this was, but he was naturally quite unsettled by the scenes unfolding before his eyes. Thus, he instantly made a grabbing motion toward the gourd, and the pillar of three-colored light within the sword formation transformed into a massive three-colored hand before flying toward the gourd with devastating might. If the gourd were indeed only an ordinary gourd, then the fearsome three-colored hand wouldn't even have to come into contact with it before the entire vine would be reduced to nothingness. Right in this instant, Han Li suddenly uttered the word slash in an indifferent manner from his vantage point in the air above. The gourd rotated on the spot as light surged around it, following which a sword of light that was around a foot in length shot forth in a flash. The sword was flashing erratically with five-colored spiritual light, and runes of different sizes were hovering around it. In the instant that the light sword was blasted forth, both the gourd and the vine dissipated into specks of spiritual light. Meanwhile, The light sword swelled to around 10 feet in size in the blink of an eye, then slashed soundlessly toward the oncoming three-colored hand, seemingly in a completely harmless manner. However, the three-colored hand was suddenly split in half without any premonition, then exploded amid a resounding boom. The giant sword then slowly changed directions and aimed itself at the elderly man, instantly drawing an alarmed expression onto his face. Chapter 1574 – Origin Chi Sword. For some reason, a sense of peril welled up in the elderly man's spiritual sense at the sight of the seemingly ordinary five-colored light sword. He immediately opened his mouth to expel a shimmering red flying sword without any hesitation. The sword was around 3 feet in length, and it was as glittering and translucent as if it had been forged from crystal. The flying sword flashed through the air as a streak of azure light, hurtling directly toward that unsettling five-colored light sword. A cold harumph rang out in the air above, and the five-colored sword abruptly slashed through the air again. The streak of crimson light instantly shuddered before reverting back to its original form as a flying sword, then plummeting directly downward. The sword had shrunk down to only several inches in length, but a sizable chink had appeared on its blade. Even though it had been sliced in half by the light sword, it had clearly been severely damaged. In the instant that the flying sword was damaged, the elderly man's face paled slightly, indicating that he'd also sustained internal injuries as a result. However, after unleashing 2 attacks, the dazzling light emanating from the five-colored light sword had dimmed significantly, and many of the runes hovering around it had also vanished. A sinister look appeared on the elderly man's face. He let loose a long cry. The three-colored light that had just been sliced apart surged toward his body before forming a suit of antiquated three-colored armor. The suit of armor didn't appear to be of a wooden nor metallic material, and it covered his entire body from head to toe, leaving only a pair of holes for his eyes. From a distance, it appeared that he had transformed into an armored giant. Immediately thereafter, the elderly man raised both arms into the air, and three-colored light flashed as an antiquated giant sword appeared in his hand. The elderly man clenched both hands around the hilt of the sword before positioning it in front of his body, and an astonishing burst of baleful chi instantly erupted into the heavens. At the same time, the blue pouch and golden flag descended from above, revolving around the elderly as a streak of blue light and a streak of golden light, respectively. Han Li's eyelids twitched involuntarily as he looked on from his hiding spot within the light barrier. Only after borrowing the world's origin chi that had been absorbed by the sword formation was he able to just barely unleash that ability, which had been named as the Origin Chi Sword Gourd by Qing Yuanzi. The ability manifested a gourd and used the sword chi from the 72 azure bamboo cloudswarm swords as a seed, then drew upon the world's origin chi to nurture a devastatingly powerful origin chi sword. The ability was extremely powerful, but it also required an astonishing amount of the world's origin chi to be unleashed. The 2 slashes that had just been unleashed had already expended close to half of the world's origin chi that had been absorbed by the sword formation. However, if the elderly man were led to believe that this was the extent of the origin chi sword's powers, then he was in for a nasty surprise. The power unleashed by the origin chi sword was completely dependent on how much of the world's origin chi was injected into the attack. Han Li was preparing to exhaust all of its remaining world's origin chi in the next attack. With that in mind, a cold smile appeared on Han Li's face, and he abruptly made a hand seal to spur the sword formation into action. Spiritual light instantly flashed from the azure light barrier, and the azure lotus flowers rotated on the spot before transforming into pillars of light that surged toward the giant light sword up above. Azure light flashed all over the entire heavens, and the azure light barrier thinned rapidly before completely vanishing. In the blink of eye, only the 72 small azure swords remained hovering in mid-air, and all of them had turned rather dull and lusterless. Without the sword formation as camouflage, Han Li had also appeared high up in the air above. After absorbing so much power, the light sword had swelled to around twice its original size, and the details of the sword had become far clearer than before. Even though it was still a 5-colored sword, the azure color was clearly far more pronounced than the other 4 colors. Slash! Han Li pointed a finger down at the elderly man as he issued a cold instruction. The giant light sword slowly rose up into the air before crashing down from above. The armored elderly man also let loose a loud cry at the same time, and he slashed his antiquated giant sword through the air in retaliation. A thin thread of crystalline light and the thick streak of three-colored sword chi approached one another amid an ear-splitting screech, but everything abruptly fell silent in the instant that the two came into contact with one another. Immediately thereafter, the crystalline light flashed past the three-colored sword chi, and the latter vanished following a dull thump. The elderly man immediately raised his giant sword to defend himself upon seeing this. A crisp clang rang out, and the elderly man remained completely motionless. However, in the next instant, a burst of azure light suddenly flashed from the giant sword, following which half of it silently crashed downward. After the giant sword had been sliced in half, the small golden flag appeared. The flag shuddered before radiating a ball of piercing golden light, then also plummeting from the sky above in two halves. Meanwhile, the chaotic heavenly pouch remained completely unscathed. The armor-clad elderly man looked up into the sky in an expressionless manner. The three-colored suit of armor he was wearing was also completely unscathed, with not even a single scratch to be seen on its surface. Han Li's pupils abruptly contracted upon seeing this, and he also looked back at his opponent with a cold expression. At the same time, an item fell soundlessly into his hand, which was hidden up his sleeve. "Does this attack have a name?" The elderly man's voice rang out from within the suit of armor, and the question caught Han Li off guard a little. "Of course. I'm sure taking on my origin chi sword wasn't a pleasant experience for you," Han Li replied as a peculiar look appeared on his face. "It was indeed quite powerful, even I was unable to completely withstand it," the elderly man harumphed coldly. As soon as his voice trailed off, a thin azure line suddenly appeared on his suit of armor. Immediately thereafter, an incision that was as smooth as a mirror's surface appeared on the seamless suit of armor, and that section of the armor crashed heavily onto the ground. Alongside the severed section of the suit of armor, one of the elderly man's huge arms had also been dismembered, and the overpowering odor of blood wafted through the air from his shoulder. However, the elderly man merely glanced at his severed arm, and it flew back of its own accord before reattaching itself to his shoulder amid a flash of white light. Immediately thereafter, he circulated his magic power within his body and made a hand seal, following which the dazzling red light appeared once again, instantly elevating the surrounding temperatures by an astonishing degree. Han Li looked down at his opponent through narrowed eyes, and he didn't attack right away. Instead, a derisive sneer appeared on his face as he scoffed. "Do you really think it's that easy to recover from a wound inflicted by my origin chi sword? What are you trying to say?" The elderly man's heart jolted with shock as he cast his gaze toward his wounded arm again, upon which a dark expression instantly appeared on his face. Blood was gushing down his reattached arm again, even though he was sure that it had been completely healed just a moment ago. As soon as you try to use your magic power, the wound will open up again. That's the true horror of the origin chi sword. Would you like to fight me without any magic power from here onward, or keep fighting me until your blood runs dry?" Han Li chuckled as he abruptly swept a sleeve through the air. A loud buzzing sound instantly erupted as several tens of golden flowers flew forth from his sleeve. As soon as they emerged from his sleeve, they immediately turned into massive sinister-looking beetles that were around half a foot in size each. The elderly man had been extremely shocked and enraged by Han Li's words, but he managed to maintain an expressionless facade. However, that facade instantly crumbled at the sight of the golden beetles. Gold-devouring beetles. You have mature gold-devouring beetles. A hint of fear appeared in the elderly man's eyes for the very first time. However, Han Li didn't even bother to give a reply as he made a hand seal, following which all of the gold-devouring beetles rapidly surged toward the elderly man. In the same instant, brilliant golden light erupted from his body as golden scales surfaced over his skin. Black light then flashed from his glabella, and an inky black demonic eye was revealed. At the same time, a golden halo abruptly appeared behind him, and the Provenance True Devil projection appeared within the halo. A loud thunderclap erupted from his body, and countless arcs of golden lightning appeared, following which he flipped a hand over, and the divine essence-fused mountain emerged again amid a flash of grey light. Meanwhile, he waved a hand toward the azure bamboo cloudswarm swords in the surrounding area, and all of them converged to form a giant azure sword that was around 10 feet in length, which then landed in his grasp. After doing all that, Han Li stepped forward with a cold expression on his face, covering a distance of over 100 feet with a single step as he strode directly toward the elderly man down below. The elderly man's expression darkened significantly upon seeing this. He looked down at his arm, which had ceased bleeding again after he'd unleashed a regenerative ability, then glanced at the several tens of massive golden beetles that were flying toward him. In the end, he gritted his teeth and suddenly opened his mouth to produce a purple talisman. The talisman exploded with a dull thump, and a cloud of purple mist permeated through the air before completely obscuring the elderly man's body within. Han Li faltered in midair upon witnessing this familiar scene, and his brows furrowed slightly. However, the gold-devouring beetles continued onward with single-minded ferocity, and they were submerged into the purple mist in the blink of an eye. Han Li immediately swept a sleeve toward the purple mist, dispersing it with a gust of fierce white winds, but sure enough, there was no longer anything within the mist. Blue light flashed through Han Li's eyes as he rapidly swept his gaze toward the ground down below, and he suddenly let loose a clear cry. Moments later, golden light flashed from the ground, and several tens of gold-devouring beetles emerged from the soil before disappearing up his sleeve. Even though he'd only used the beetles for a short while, Han Li could sense that close to half of his spiritual sense had been expended. Thankfully, his spiritual sense had become far more powerful after progressing to the spatial tempering stage. Otherwise, he definitely wouldn't have dared to release so many gold-devouring beetles at once. Through the use of his spirit eye ability, he was able to ascertain that the elderly man had already fled to close to 10 kilometers away as a purple shadow underground, seemingly having truly been frightened away by Han Li's powers. Chapter 1575. Retreat. Han Li looked on at the fleeing purple shadow, and made no effort to give chase. Even if he wanted to chase down his opponent, the elderly man's earth movement technique granted him superior speed to Han Li anyway. Furthermore, Han Li was also aware of the fact that his opponent had essentially only been frightened away by a bluff. He had been struck by the Origin Chi sword, resulting in profuse bleeding whenever he tried to use his magic power, which was obviously quite unsettling. On top of that, the vastly renowned gold-devouring beetles coupled with his immense display of power further chipped away at his opponent's confidence in winning this battle, thereby leading to him fleeing the scene. In reality, if the elderly man were to use his movement techniques to stall for time, the effect of the Origin Chi sword would soon wear off, and Han Li wouldn't be able to continue using his gold-devouring beetles for much longer, either. In that case, the winner of the battle would still be a mystery. This was why Han Li had decided against hunting down his fleeing opponent. Furthermore, even though he was quite far away from Greenlight City already, Jiao Kai race reinforcements could still arrive at any moment. This was also why he'd unleashed that final Origin Chi sword strike even at the expense of his sword formation. Compared to the threat posed by the elderly man, he was more wary of Jiao Kai race reinforcements. The elderly man disappeared into the distance while Han Li stowed away his treasures without any hesitation, then also departed as an azure thread. However, he was naturally flying away in a different direction, and he quickly also disappeared from view. Thus, the forest that had been plunged into disarray became a peaceful place once again. However, only about 15 minutes later, spiritual light flashed in the sky, and 2 streaks of light rapidly hurtled forth from Greenlight City. After just a few flashes, they arrived in the air above the forest, following which the light receded to reveal a pair of humanoid figures. One of them was the elderly man who had just fled the scene, and he had reverted back to his original form. His companion was none other than the other body integration stage being among their ranks, the silver-robed middle-aged man. He really has already left. At that person's speed, he must be close to 100,000 kilometers away now, the elderly man said with a frustrated expression as he appraised the ruined forest down below. Of course he's already left, only an insane person would continue to remain here. He must already be too far away for the profound heaven-shifting disk to be effective. Besides, we've already used it once today, and we'll have to wait at least 3 days before we can use it again. I'm rather curious, just how was a mere spatial tempering stage being able to harm you, brother too? The middle-aged man asked in a contemplative manner as he looked down at the massive crater on the ground below. An awkward look appeared on the elderly man's face upon hearing this, but that was quickly replaced by a furious expression as he glanced at his own shoulder. I was too complacent and became trapped in that man's sword formation. The sword formation was extremely powerful and difficult to deal with. On top of that, he possessed a few other powerful abilities and treasures as well, so I had no choice but to retreat. Oh, by the way, he also possesses a few dozens of mature gold-devouring beetles. What? Gold-devouring beetles? The middle-aged had remained quite composed initially, but his expression changed drastically at the mention of these beetles. If it weren't for those beetles, I wouldn't have fled the battle, the elderly man said with a bitter and resentful expression. If he possesses a few dozens of those beetles, then even true holy race beings would be wary of this man in battle. However, if it's less than 100, then top-grade wood or stone treasures should still be able to temporarily trap them. The middle-aged man finally managed to recompose himself after a while. If he had more than 100 mature gold-devouring beetles, then I would have urged you to flee this place right away. How would I dare to bring you back to this place? The elderly man chuckled with a wry smile on his face. In the face of a swarm of thousands of mature gold-devouring beetles, even holy race beings would be killed for sure. I've heard that a swarm of mature gold-devouring beetles that numbered in the tens of thousands once appeared on the Thunder Continent, and the 3 or 4 minor races nearby were all eradicated by the swarm of beetles with ease. At the time, a super race used the profound heavenly treasure, the heaven-vanquishing hammer, to smash open a spatial rift and funnel all of these spirit insects into a space outside the spirit realm. Otherwise, they would have wreaked even more havoc on the continent, the middle-aged man mused. At this moment, a thought suddenly occurred to the middle-aged, and his expression changed slightly as he asked, "But then again, nurturing gold-devouring beetles is extremely difficult. It's one of the most troublesome types of spirit insects to breed, and many people have expended a vast amount of effort to nurture them without any success. I wonder what power that man hails from to be able to bring out a few dozens of those beetles at once. Could he be a member of the 13 heavenly cloud races?" The elderly man contemplated the notion for a moment before shaking his head. No. The treasures I was carrying exhibited no reaction toward him, and I was unable to pinpoint what kind of being he was from his physical appearance, either. In that case, things will be a little troublesome for us. If he's carrying a jade box with him, then it'll be very difficult for us to recover it, the middle-aged man said with furrowed brows. How many boxes did you recover, fellow Daoist Ning? The elderly man asked. I managed to secure 2 boxes. That myriad ancient being was quite sly and cunning. He tried to threaten me with the destruction of the box in an attempt to get away. Thankfully, my blood-melting technique is quite proficient in sneak attacks, so I was able to catch him off guard and kill him on the spot. The middle-aged man flipped a hand over as he spoke, and 2 identical boxes appeared in his grasp, both of which had restriction talismans plastered onto their surfaces. It turned out that the big-headed being still had 2 jade boxes left even after giving out 1 each to Han Li's trio. The elderly man nodded as he rustled his sleeve to summon a jade box as well. It was none other than the one that he'd obtained from the green-skinned being. In that case, we have 3 boxes. How many boxes did Hong Yin report that the myriad ancient being was in possession of? Perhaps the elderly man had truly forgotten, or he was simply asking for confirmation. In any case, he turned to his companion and raised the question with an inquisitive look on his face. 5 or 6, the information he sent back to us wasn't very accurate, either, the middle-aged man replied after a brief hesitation. 5 or 6. What a troublesome number. That means that man is carrying at least 2 jade boxes with him, the elderly man sighed. I'm afraid so. On top of that, he appears to be quite powerful, so Hong Yin must have fallen by his hands. We can't allow him to get away with this. The middle-aged man's expression darkened as he spoke in a cold voice. But he's completely disappeared now. How are we going to find him again? The elderly man asked. We obviously won't be able to do that on our own, but don't forget that most of the cities in this area are under our race's control. We can contact the closest few cities using our myriad distance talismans and request assistance from them to hunt down that man. The people deployed to search for him don't have to be very powerful, either. All they have to do is to startle him into showing himself, and we'll immediately get to him using a teleportation formation, the middle-aged man suggested. That's certainly worth a try. The elderly man didn't have high hopes for the proposed course of action, but he couldn't think of any better alternatives, so he still nodded in agreement in the end. Immediately thereafter, the elderly man rustled a sleeve, and a green rock tablet appeared in his hand. He then quickly inscribed something on the tablet with his finger, leaving lines of faint golden text on its surface. Moments later, the elderly man had finished writing his message, and he laid a hand over the tablet, upon which the lines of text instantly disappeared amid a flash of light. Let's return to the battle arc first. That myriad ancient beings set up a self-detonating formation in the city, but our detection treasures managed to discover the formation, and someone has since disabled it. However, there are still many other things to be taken care of. We'll be busy for quite a while to come, the middle-aged man said with a faint smile. Looks like we have no choice. The elderly man naturally had no objections, and the two of them returned the way they'd come as two streaks of light, quickly disappearing into the distance. Han Li fled for around 500,000 kilometers, and only after he was sure that no Jiao Kai beings could possibly chase him down did he decelerate to his normal speed. After just a prolonged period of high-speed flight, even Han Li was feeling a little worse for wear. Thus, he swept a hand over his storage bracelet, and a pair of green stones immediately appeared in his grasp. These were two top-grade wood attribute spirit stones. Spirit stones of this caliber were quite rare, but in his current perilous situation, Han Li couldn't afford to be stingy, so he immediately began to absorb the spiritual power within the spirit stones as he held on in each hand. Thankfully, the surrounding area was extremely bleak and desolate. Han Li picked a mountain at random to descending onto, then sat with his legs crossed beneath a large yet extremely obscure tree to begin recovering his magic power. The Spring Dawn Sword formation was indeed extraordinarily powerful, but it also expended a huge amount of magic power to unleash. In particular, that final strike from the Origin Chi sword had been extremely draining. Thus, Han Li sat on the summit of the mountain beneath the large tree, and no one else passed through the area. After about half a day had passed, Han Li had recovered most of his magic power. He reopened his eyes with an elated expression on his face, and displayed no intention of staying here any longer. Thus, he stowed away the spirit stone and hurtled into the air as a streak of azure light again. After flying for over 1,000 feet, the streak of green light suddenly became very blurry and barely visible. Within the azure light, Han Li pulled out a jade slip. This was none other than the map of the surrounding area that Han Li had obtained from Xianxia prior to teleporting to Green Light Island. Even though the Flame Coral Islands had been out of contact with the Thunder Continent for thousands of years, most of the things on the map should have remained the same. Thus, Han Li's spiritual sense seeped into the jade slip as he began to search for a suitable route from here onward. He didn't know how much control the Jiao Kai race had over this area, but he definitely wasn't going to visit the few nearby cities. Instead, he was planning to skirt around all of these cities and head toward the largest city that belonged to the 13 heavenly cloud races in this area, Golden Armor City. It was said that this city was situated in an extremely important location, so not only was it the largest city that belonged to the 13 heavenly cloud races in this area, it was also guarded by a large number of elite forces from the 13 races. At the same time, there were also many high-grade beings defending the city. If he weren't mistaken, the Jiao Kai race was most likely planning to eradicate all of the nearby cities first before attacking Golden Armor City. With that in mind, Han Li looked up at the suns in the sky to recalibrate himself, then flew toward the direction that he'd decided on.